Very warm welcome to Dr. Jim Ackers. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Ackers, who is the Regional Education Advisor at the UNICEF Regional Office for South Asia, or what's called ROSA, in Kathmandu, where he provides oversight for education programs across 8 countries. Jim holds a PhD in education policy from the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in the United Kingdom. He has published extensively in many leading refereed journals. And of course, most recently, he was the co-editor of the publication Education Response to COVID-19 Pandemic, which was a special issue of the International Journal of Educational Development. Jim has been with UNICEF for 13 years, starting as the Chief of Education in Nairobi in 2003 to 2007. He currently covers areas ranging from early childhood education, primary and secondary education, and adolescent skills and employability, and of course disability issues, which is core of UNICEF. Recently, under his leadership, UNICEF South Rosa developed a regional strategy on technology for learning and a blog on the need for essential learning packages to address the risk of continued disruption in education in South Asia forward. As you know, UNICEF has contributed tremendously in the last 2 years on COVID-related issues, and I'm sure Jim will bring those perspectives to the table today, which will enrich our discussion. And Jim, over to you, Jim, for your presentation.
Just getting my slides in order. Great. Okay. No, thank you very much, Dr. Mahandapala. And I think initially it was yourself who, suggested to me that I might join this this very interesting discussion around the long-term impact of COVID. And Professor Pia, to both of you, indeed, it's an honor to be asked to join this very important deliberation. I've actually been in UNICEF for 18 years. I probably gave you some misinformation there. And the interesting thing is that I actually retire from UNICEF next Monday. So this is actually my last presentation as a UNICEF staff member. So it's a real honor to be able to give it to the Sri Lanka Academy of Science. In fact, one of my last field visits was to Sri Lanka in January 2020, just before the pandemic really took off. And it was the first time I've been to Sri Lanka. I actually went into some schools and saw some really good pedagogy, which it shows that we can be changing the way that we actually teach and so on. My title is Learning Transformation for All Post-COVID-19, which looks extremely positive in terms of intention. It suggests that, we're on the cusp of really transforming education because of what we've learned perhaps from COVID. But I think you'll see during the presentation that we have a lot of really critical challenges in the short term before we can really transform education into something which reaches everybody and is of higher quality. So let me move now to the actual outline of the presentation. I'll be looking at, first of all, at the overview of global impact of school closures, and then focusing on the impacts and responses to COVID-19 on education, remote learning challenges, the impact of school closures on learning, how we might mitigate learning loss, how countries can support recovery efforts, and then moving on to perhaps more of the agenda reflected in the title, what we can do to transform education to keep us on track for SDG 4 and indeed the SDGs more generally. And then finally, I'll be looking at what are the key questions that we need to be asking ourselves about education in future if we are really to take this, what some people say, once in a lifetime opportunity to transform education. So that's the menu essentially. I'll move on to the next slide. So this slide actually gives you a picture of the impact of COVID globally in terms of school closures. And what you can see at a glance is that in some countries, schools were actually between the period of February 2020 to January 2022, which is nearly 2 years. In some countries, schools were closed for as much as 41 weeks. Particularly if you look at Latin America, it's been a big issue there. In some parts of Africa, Middle East in particular. And then if you move down a little bit, where schools were closed between 31 and 40 weeks, then you start seeing the countries in our region, in South Asia. There's been a lot of school closures in South Asia. So that's the first slide in terms of the level of school closures over this period. The next slide is particularly looking at our own region, and it's a very concerning slide. If you look at red, essentially it means that schools were closed. If you look at yellow, it means that schools were partially open. And if you look at green, it means that schools were open. And this is over a period of 2 years. So of course, the country which is of most concern to us in the South Asia office has been Bangladesh, which was the schools were fully closed for a period of 18 months. If you look at Afghanistan, there's been closure, there's been partial reopening, there's been some full reopening, etc. If you look at Bhutan, there's been a good period from March 2021, and that's partly because Bhutan felt it could isolate itself from the spread of the pandemic. In terms of Sri Lanka itself, and I know this meeting is not just about Sri Lanka, but in terms of Sri Lanka, schools were fully closed for 50 weeks and partially closed for 23 weeks. Well, essentially, I think the message here is very worrying. It means that a lot of children have only been receiving a partial education or no face-to-face education for a very long period of time. And therefore, this is likely to have quite a significant impact on learning loss. Moving on to the next slide. So a lot of what I present today will actually be drawn from the situation analysis on the effects of and responses to COVID-19 on the education sector in Asia. Now, first of all, of course, you have the direct impact of COVID on education. The direct impact, I would say, would be the infection rates of students, the infection rates of teachers, etc. And then you have the indirect impacts. Now, of course, one of the indirect impacts has been the closure of schools. It has not been a necessary impact because global agencies such as WHO, UNICEF, and the UN bodies as a whole have urged countries to keep schools open and only close them as a last resort and to reopen them as soon as possible. But clearly that message has not really got through to policymakers. Maybe it's also not got through to teachers, and maybe it's also not got through to parents. So there's been a real communication challenge. And maybe again, it does relate to what the resident coordinator just described as the infodemic. There's been a lack of trust in official guidance and scientific guidance around school closures. So one of the in the initial days when schools were actually closing down, some people from different agencies, also governments, were actually quite excited about the potential of distance learning. They felt that it could actually be a more efficient, more up-to-date way of reaching children, etc. I think in some systems there was governments were struggling with maybe teacher management issues. Teachers are often quite poorly paid, motivation levels might be quite poor. So I think quite a few agencies and governments were quite excited about what might happen if we move towards distance education. And one of the big issues that we were trying to engage with as UNICEF and other agencies was trying to shift people's thinking a little bit away from just looking at COVID in terms of a health risk, and therefore closing all schools whenever, as a kind of knee-jerk reaction, and also to look at the other risk, which was the risk to learning if children were deprived of being able to go to school. So that was a kind of argument we were trying to put to the different countries in the region and globally. So there was a lot of creativity initially in the COVID response. A lot of governments started TV programs, radio programs, etc., to try and compensate for the fact that children were not able to go to school. But there were many challenges to this, to the effectiveness of this approach. And these, I think, are the basic reasons for the challenge. And the first one is the very limited access to digital devices, whether that's a computer or whether that's a smartphone, etc. And secondly, something a little bit less obvious, actual capacity to use digital devices. So they were both big issues. Inability to shift to digital learning in the case of parents who were supporting children's education at home, and also teachers. There's a real threat now that teachers can be left behind. Quite often students are more adept in terms of digital engagement than their own teachers. And then there's a quality of learning resources. Of course, you can always say we have distance learning now, this can transform your education. But if you've worked in the development of distance learning materials, you realize it takes a long time to develop high quality programs. As I said before, TV and radio have limited utility. They're not really interactive ways. You can build interaction around them, but by nature, they're not really interactive. You don't pause television broadcasts and ask children then to look at workbooks, etc. One of the very interesting things happening during the pandemic, though, was that people were not initially aware of the potential of mobile phones as a new media of learning. But of course, mobile phones in themselves are very limited because of the size of the screen, etc. But if combined with other forms, can be very powerful. And finally, there's the obvious challenge of the cost of devices and the lack of connectivity. So these are the challenges that we found through our research on remote learning in the region. And just to bring this down to the actual case now of Sri Lanka itself, where we did a case study on remote learning. And on the bottom axis there, you have the access rate. So access rate to TV, of course, is very high, about 90%. And then you've got the access rate to computers, which is very low, about 15%. So this has been one of the challenges, the actual access to these different media. But then what's very interesting on the left is we have the usage or utilization. So what's interesting here is that although access to basic phones and radio, TV is very high, they haven't actually been used very much by the learner. What has been used a lot in Sri Lanka, and I think Sri Lanka was one of the lead countries in this, is printed materials. A lot of countries were focusing too much on distance learning type materials, electronic devices, TV, etc., and neglecting what children can actually take home in their hands and actually read at home. Another interesting area that was a little bit neglected in the discourse was textbooks, which for me are it's an obvious resource for children if they're stuck at home. If a teacher can actually be interacting with them around the textbooks, they can continue learning. So that's the situation on the left in terms of the public schools. I think the other interesting thing here in the study in Sri Lanka is the contrast between private schools and study schools. private schools and public schools. So if you look, for example, on the right of the graphic, on the right-hand graphic, smartphones were highly utilized were highly available, first of all, for children going to private schools, and were utilized much more than any other medium. Printed packs, much lower in the private schools, etc. But essentially the utilization rates of these different modalities was also higher in the private schools, which again, raises the issue of equity of access, which was mentioned on the first day. Showing you another graphic here, again from Sri Lanka, which is something which people, I don't think, thought sufficiently about initially. They just thought if children can connect to a device, an internet, then they can learn. But of course, as particularly younger children, you still need support. You need support from teachers, and you also need support from parents if you're going to cope with learning from home. So here, if you look at, I mean, the data which strikes me most is that if you look at the graphic on the left, and that is the frequency of teacher contact during school closures. If you look at private schools, 52% of students had contact from teachers over 5 days. Only 8% of children in state schools had that contact. So again, you see the big discrepancies. And on the right, you see the discrepancies in terms of teacher support, parental support as well. And of course, more middle-class parents, more educated parents tend to give more support to their children than less educated parents. Well, that's not always the case if you have two educated parents who are both working. But again, you can see some inequalities on the right. So one of the big issues initially was the different development ages were trying to gauge what will the impact be on children's learning. And the initial sort of analyses and modeling was looking at things like the Ebola crisis, looking at earthquakes in Pakistan and so on, and seeing what extent that had impacted on children's learning. Because it's quite difficult to get assessment data on children's learning rapidly. But what has been very promising is that there is a study called ASER, which is a community-based approach to assessment. You might call it quick and dirty to some extent, rather than the large assessment exercises, but it is rapid. And what we really learned from the COVID period is that we need rapid responses. We need to know how many children are in school and out of schools rapidly. We need to know what they're learning rapidly in order that we can adapt the response to COVID. And I think the striking thing here is that in rural Karnataka in India, the proportion of children in grade 3, you could read at least a grade 1 level text. Now, grade 3 should be reading grade 3 level text, but this shows the level of the learning crisis before COVID. Okay, could read at least a grade 1 level text, fell sharply from 41% to 24% in 2020. That's a very significant loss. And then if you look at rural Pakistan, the percentage of children who can read a story in Urdu has already dropped from 42% to 23%. And that really shouldn't be the case if children are learning remotely, effectively remotely. The children who can do division in mathematics moving down from 34% to 15%. Read sentences in English going down from 43 to 25%. So learning loss is a really critical issue. And the really worrying thing is if children, if that is not addressed, whether children can really restart learning effectively. So moving on to my next slide. So this slide, well, first of all, I just want to refer to the statement from the World Bank here. What will be the impact of learning of COVID on learning will also, according to the World Bank, then translate into a major impact on children's lifelong learnings. They say they now risk losing $17 trillion in lifetime earnings in present value as a result of school closures. So again, I think the World Bank has been pushing for schools to remain open as long as possible, and also for good remediation in education. Now, in this graphic here is from the Brookings Institute in the US, and it looks at the long-term learning loss from COVID-19 school closures and mitigation strategies if you're looking, for example, at a grade 3 cohort. And what essentially it says is that the shock of an event like COVID could reduce grade 3 learning by 1/3. And this would have a long-term impact over time, which will still be felt when they get to grade 10. However, if after the shock you have good remediation, and I'm going to explain what remediation means in a minute, you can minimize that loss down to about 0.54 of a year learning loss. Also, if you can not only do the remediation, but also change the way that you do instruction, and just to say very briefly what I mean by that is that you teach in a differentiated way. You don't assume that all learners are at the same level. If you can radically change the instruction modeling, you can actually make a major gain. There could be a major gain from this crisis. Just moving on to my next slide. I don't know my slides. Oh, yeah, okay, I'll do it this way. So what is required to support these recovery efforts to make sure that this learning loss does not translate from being something short-term to being a learning loss for a whole generation of students? Well, financing is clearly a key enabler to learning recovery, and it should be prioritized as a gateway, not just to learning, but also to human rights in general and to human capital development. You will never have human capital development, you'll never have economic prosperity in this century unless you have high levels of learning across society and they have the right skills, etc., including employability skills. One statistic which is seldom shared by the donors is the discrepancy between investments in low-income countries per child compared to high-income countries. And it is very, very worrying. If you look at low-income countries across the world, it's about $48 per year is invested in a child's education compared to $8,500 in high-income countries. People seldom talk about this, but it's quite a shocking inequality. I just want to move down now to looking at investment patterns in South Asia pre-COVID, and we got data here on a series of different governments, including the one which is doing really well here is Bhutan. It's above the 6% GDP recommended by UNESCO, and Nepal is also doing quite well. And then down right at the bottom, you can see Bangladesh is really not doing very well at all in terms of percentage of GDP. And also Sri Lanka is not doing well. And it picked up, moving more towards 4% in 2016. But more recently, 2018, it's come down to around about 2% of GDP. So this will be a serious challenge, the amount of investment in education. Moving on to the next slide, more towards the qualitative aspects, what is required to mitigate learning loss? Well, one of the critical things is that there must be curriculum modification. If during a school year, children are not covering the curriculum, you cannot simply assume that the curriculum has been covered and then move on to from grade 2 to the grade 3 curriculum. That could be very, very damaging. You have to modify, you may have to focus on critical subjects, etc. Another obvious thing which which government should be doing, is considering things like, well, certainly after there was only 1 year of learning loss, maybe we can just repeat the year. That would actually make a lot of sense if children have lost most of what they should have learned. However, many countries have gone for automatic promotion. And sometimes now with 2 years of learning loss due to COVID, it means that some children who were at grade 1 but didn't learn very much since being in grade 1 are now being automatically promoted to grade 3. I find that very worrying. Another critical thing is to do diagnostic and formative assessment to find out where children are before you move on with the learning program. Teacher support and capacity building will be really critical. And we should also keep parents, caregivers, and classroom assistants on board, because if we're going to move more towards inclusive education in classrooms, you need the personnel in the classroom to help ensure that you have this differentiated approach to learning. Learning materials extremely important, an integrated learning approach. Sometimes people talking about blended learning, so you can move from remote learning to face-to-face learning seamlessly. And some countries like Bangladesh are developing strategies on that. The other thing we really need to counter the infodemic is good communication strategies, right down to community level, from the national level to the district level, etc. And this has been a real problem in terms of the COVID response. And you need very effective monitoring, including monitoring the school attendance and remote learning. So these are things required to mitigate learning loss. And I think Sri Lanka is actually doing very well in terms of packaging these approaches. It's actually been seen as an exemplary country, and we've asked Sri Lanka to talk in Asia Pacific forums on how it's packaged its approach. Many countries haven't. The approach is very fragmented. So how can education be transformed to achieve SDG 4? What role might technology play? And what are the critical variables? So I'm moving on to the final part of my presentation now. And I just want to share this infographic. This is a GIGA, which is a global initiative supported by UNICEF, the World Bank, ITU, etc. And it's an initiative which is also, we've developed Asia Pacific Technical Working Group to further this work around reimagining education, building back better. And I don't really have time to go into it now, but essentially you've got to be looking at the content, connectivity, devices, etc. And I think one thing I just want to touch on before I move on, which I think has been understated quite often, is you need to look at the governance, monitoring, and quality assurance of what we do through technology for learning. And I think that came up with Hannah Singer Hamdi's presentation, the dangers of the infodemic, etc. Moving on to my next slide. So transforming education for all, what are the key questions? These are the key questions we need to ask. And I'm moving on to them quickly now. I think one of the first ones will be, how will people be learning? Well, I think the first thing to be stated is that children are already learning much more from informal sources like the internet than they are from classrooms. The second thing is that learning will be much more asynchronous. Now, not everybody will be learning together. Another thing which I think technology has shown is that we could be using a lot more simulations. So even if you don't have a science lab at school, you can still be doing simulations virtually. But most critically, I think from what I was saying before, we need to have more differentiation in classrooms. I hope that is how people will be learning. There'll be more learner autonomy, more differentiation. What should we be learning? A lot of people now are saying focus on literacy and numeracy foundational, and I think that's extremely important. But we also need to be looking at employability skills, what was called STEM, 21st century skills, etc. And we really need to be focusing in on science and making sure that education doesn't become politicized so that science is sidelined. And one of the critical things that we should be doing as teachers is that making sure that children can manage the infodemic, the social media, etc. Provision of learning, we're already, it's become quite disparate. Government, private sector was really blooming before COVID. It's retracted a little bit since COVID. And there will be a lot more provision of education as a public good. I think we have to be a little bit careful here. We don't want sort of KFC or McDonald's type learning packages. We have to protect the cultural capital of countries. So that's something to look out for. But what I do hope is that we may have, it may be that all adolescents can actually access online secondary education at no cost. That would be fantastic. So how will learning be monitored? Well, we have to move away from these very slow systems, go much more towards rapid systems, which can capture real-time data. And then finally, the big issue, I think, for agencies like the UN is how will we ensure that all children and adolescents are reached? This is going to be the big challenge, because education is already transformed for the more elite children going to private schools and international schools, etc. Our challenge will be trying to make sure that all children also get those advantages. The final slide is essentially a list of key references, but thank you very much for listening. I hope I didn't go on for too long there. Over.
Thank you, Jim, for that most informative and interesting address. And I think much of that information is not known by many, although you have very scientifically provided this. I'm sure there are questions and comments, but one of the things that I've noticed is that of Professor Madhuma Bandara. Madhuma, do you like to, or do you want me to say your question? Okay. Well, well, we have a reference to a lost generation, which Professor Madhuma Bandara is. His question is, your reference to a lost generation is challenging and interesting. Can you elaborate, characterize the salient signs of that generation?
Yeah, would you like me to respond to that?
Yes,
immediately?
Yes, yes.
Please, I can hear.
Yeah, well, I think you know, initially we were really not aware of the scale of the learning loss, but if you look at the data that I presented from ASER in India and Pakistan, we can see that children have already lost a lot of what they've been learning at school, because they've been out of school for too long, but also the quality of the remote learning has not been very good. But I think issues like that can be addressed. I mean, you will talk to many eminent people who, for example, whose education was disrupted due to wars, etc. In our own case in the UK, we had the First World War, we had the Second World War. Not everybody who was going to school during that period turned out to be sort of deficient in terms of personal capacity. But we can see that there has been quite an immediate shock on children's learning. So the issue really is that we really need to focus in on those remediation efforts. And one of my main worries with I think even the international agencies was that, in a sense, there was too much focus on reimagining education and the technology response in the longer term, and not just getting stuff together properly in packaged way so that children catch up on that learning rapidly and they get those building blocks in place. I mean, I think particularly in subjects like mathematics, if you were to jump from grade 1 to grade 3, which is happening in some countries, without those foundational blocks being in place, children will learn nothing in mathematics. So it is a real worry, but I think it is something we can address if we do it systematically.
Thank you, Jim. Nadira, you have a question? Would you like to? Nadira's question is, how do you suggest we deal with the assessments or barrier exams that continue to operate?
Yeah, Yeah, this has been a huge issue in many countries, and it's something which has also been, politically very charged, because parents with children coming up to examinations whose future is threatened because sometimes they weren't able to hold the examinations, etc. It's a very tricky one, and I think in countries where you also have things like continuous assessment in schools, like for example in the UK, where there's continuous assessment, the assessment of the teacher is actually being used for the final summative assessment of the student rather than a formal examination. But this is certainly a critical challenge. But the other thing I was trying to say about assessment as well is that we should not be focusing at the moment so much on what we call assessment of learning, but assessment for learning. So what we should be doing, and this is something you do at the classroom level, is trying to assess what areas of the curriculum do children understand now before you move on with the curriculum.
That's a question which answer is a bit obvious, but I nevertheless put it. It's about the point that you brought in with the difference between the public schools and the private schools. And the first comment here, as you see, children in public schools always had the higher tendency of missing out on lessons during lockdowns, whereas those in private schools they had a greater advantage. Now, how can this challenge be overcome? It's the inequity that's there, but I will ask Jim if you have any other comments to make.
Yeah, I mean, there's whole literature around private schools and private schools for the private schools can be elite schools, but you also have private schools for the poor, where the state doesn't reach. And it's a very contested sort of area with several eminent sort of academics, some pushing for the privatization of education, saying that state education simply isn't working in low resource environments and so on. But I think the data that's come out more recently suggests that countries that have gone more towards marketization of education, which is something which, for example, Margaret Thatcher was pushing in the UK and President Reagan and so on, countries like Sweden that have gone more for a market approach, the aggregate learning level of children has actually come down. So it's created more inequalities. But I think the way to look at private education is that I think state education has to learn from private education. And one of the reasons why private education is often more robust in situations like COVID is that there is an accountability between the teachers and the parents. And that's partly because the parents are paying fees, so they can hold teachers accountable. But I don't see any reason also why teachers and head teachers cannot be held accountable to parents in the state system as well. We have to look at what making things work in the private sector, in my view, and apply those to the state sector as well.
I think there's just time for another 2 questions, but there's one interesting one. Is there some strategies or plans for recovery of learning loss? I think this learning loss is some very important point that you brought out, Jim, but are there some strategies, particularly for South Asia, as you are very closely involved?
Yeah, at UNICEF, UNICEF Rosa, we coined this phrase called the essential learning packages, because we think it would be very arrogant of us as an agency to develop a package and say everyone should buy into this package. But essentially, what you need to do, and there's one of the slides I tried to dwell on a little bit, is that you need to package that approach. And I think in Sri Lanka, it has been done well. Part of that packaging is that you have to do the diagnostic assessment to try and find out what has been learned, what hasn't been learned, right. And then the formative assessment, how each individual child is proceeding. You've got to train the teachers, you've got to get the right materials in place, you've got to adapt the curriculum, etc. So yeah, I think you have to have a sort of a coherent packaged approach to this. And remediation is not something you just do over a few weeks. It may have to actually continue either in parallel. In fact, really, it has to come before you resume the normal curriculum. You have to do the remediation before you start going back to the curriculum. The biggest risk is a teacher will say that, okay, 2 years ago, we were on page 5. Now it's, we're starting class today. Let's go on to page 6 and continue as if nothing happened. And you're smiling there, Ranjiv, but actually in reality, that is happening in a lot of places. Yeah, governments just want to get, they don't want to be seen to be pushing children even further behind. Let's just crack on. Let's just pick up the textbooks and carry on as if nothing's happened. So that is really dangerous. Yeah.
The last question is that you showed very clearly the drop in investments on education in South Asia, but and also COVID pandemic has actually affected the economies of all these countries. Now, in this complex situation where the government will have to now balance the investment on various other services, if there are any plans to advise governments on increasing education allocations in the light of what's happening with COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I was trying to say, and perhaps it was pretty information heavy, what I was saying today, is that I think the best way to convince government of the need to invest in education is not just to focus on learning outcomes, but also to look at development in terms of the individual, in terms of society, in terms of the economy. The human capital focus, I think, is really, really important. And of course, there will be a temptation from some governments now to focus in more on other sectors than on education. But I think if countries do this, ultimately their human capital in comparison to other competitive countries will be reduced. So I think that is a very dangerous thing. And I just want to say a final comment as well about something I didn't touch on, but I feel very strongly about, is that I think we now have an opportunity to really refocus again on health promoting schools. And what really came out of the pandemic was initially people thought it's quite exciting. Everyone can learn by themselves, no need to go to school, etc. But after a while, we saw that children were really missing school. They were missing it for the social aspect. And then the poorer children were also missing things like school meals, health education, etc. Mental health has been a huge issue. So I think the COVID response in education has got to be a cross-sectoral response. And again, I think Sri Lanka has actually done very well in that respect compared to most other countries in the region.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim, and it was very comprehensive presentation. And we also note that this will be your last UNICEF presentation, and we wish you a very happy retirement, a very busy retirement. And I do hope we'll be in touch. Thank you once again, Jim. This would have continued if not for the time constraints, and catch up with you later. Thank you once again, Jim.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.